Welcome to tonight's concert called Bach and Stravinsky. We are performing three works, starting with Suite Number 2 by Johann Sebastian Bach, followed by a harp concertino by Germaine Tailleferre, and then finally concluding with Pulcinella Suite by Igor Stravinsky. Bach wrote there are four suites that are written for different configurations of orchestra. And we don't know exactly what year these were written. These were discovered later. Some place it, this particular suite, the second suite you're going to hear tonight, between 1738 and 1739. And what's interesting about this particular suite is that it's essentially a hybrid between flute concerto and a suite, a dance suite. All of these suites were essentially done in the form or in the manner that was popular in France under the rule of Louis XIV. There was a famous composer / conductor by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lully, and he would write these pieces called overtures. Overtures in French essentially just meant opening piece. And these pieces would start often with a slow introduction, as you would hear in the Bach. And it features what we call the dotted rhythm. So you will hear the rhythm like yum, ba-bum, ba-bum. This kind of bouncy dotted rhythm is featured throughout the slow introduction of French overture. And then it's followed by a fast section that features prominently the idea of fugato. It's essentially a musical line that is started off on one group of instrument and soon later is followed by copied by another group of instrument and so on until everybody else enters. And then it comes back to the slow introduction at the very end. And that's sort of what the musicologists call the French overture format. And Bach uses this perfectly in the first movement of this. And essentially all of the movements that follow are fashioning of various dance forms that were popular during that day. So dances like Polonaise or Bourrée, for instance. And throughout all of these, the flute acts sometimes to add a splash of color, if you would. They're doubling what the first violins are playing, exact same thing, but of course, when you have the flute and the violins playing together, that is a different color than just the violins playing it, or just the flute playing it. So it plays more of a complementary role. And then in each movement, there comes a point in which flute is featured more as a soloist. So the flute might play something with more ornament, so more dressings around the notes, while the orchestra is playing the simple accompaniment, and then goes back and forth. And so it's really it's not called a concerto, but it is considered one of the pieces that the flutists love to play with an orchestra. And so it's a great pleasure for us to have Wendy Cohen, who is our principal flutist, in the solo role for the Bach in this piece. What follows are two pieces, both written in the 1920s, so almost 200 years after Bach wrote the suite, a suite in B minor. And they're both, Pulcinella was written in 1920 originally. The suite from the ballet we're going to hear tonight was written a couple years later in 1922. And the concertino for harp by Tailleferre was written in 1927. So this is the time in the 20th century. Imagine after pieces like The Rite of Spring, which of course Stravinsky wrote in 1913, then came the First World War. And in the realm of music, and some of this was necessitated by sort of the financial situation right at the aftermath of this war. But imagine this huge war with trench warfare, so many casualties. And there was a movement at that point in the 20s, you see in many countries in Europe in particular, sort of yearning for the music of the past, sort of the simplicity of the past. So that's what sort of created this neoclassical movement in music. And neoclassical often actually means neo-Baroque. So composers like Stravinsky and Tailleferre would go back to the music of Bach and his contemporaries as a source of inspiration They loved the economy of forces that were used in earlier music, as opposed to pieces like The Rite of Spring or Mahler symphonies, for instance, or Richard Strauss tone poems that are written for huge orchestra. Now you see composers like Stravinsky trying to get as many colors as possible, but using smaller forces, maybe 35 to 40 member orchestra, more intimate in nature, and sort of going back to the structure and forms that were used by the composers of the past, but fashioning them in their own way in the 20th century style. So you'll see both examples of this in the two pieces that make up the last portion of the concert. Germaine Tailleferre, she was one of the composers of the collective known as Les Six, or the Six, in France. And there were composers like Poulenc, who was part of this, and you will hear Poulenc's concerto for two pianos at our concert in June this season as well. Tailleferre grew up playing the piano and so on since she was very little, very talented, but her father really did not want her pursuing a career in music as a composer. So what happened was her mother sent her to the conservatory, Paris Conservatory, sort of under the radar. Her father only found out that Tailleferre was enrolled at the conservatory when he read in the papers that his daughter won a big prize at the conservatory. And so that was sort of how he found out. And when he found that out, he changed his mind a little bit. He became a little bit more supportive. But Tailleferre never really got over that initial rejection of her passion, her career pursuit, support, a lack of support from her father, so much so that she actually changed her last name to Tailleferre. It was Tailleferre initially, but when she turned 18, she actually changed her last name as a sort of a revenge almost. And then she joined the circle of Les Six, and she became friends with who's who of the arts world. She said the best composition lesson she ever got was from Picasso, actually, who told her that any great artist must always continue to reinvent him or herself, and you should not rely on the recipe that you've already found to create new works. And so she said that was one of the most useful lessons that she learned. She was also great friends with Maurice Ravel, whose Mother Goose Suite you heard last month. Charlie Chaplin desperately wanted her to write scores for his films, but never panned out. People like Diaghilev commissioned her. Diaghilev was an impresario who commissioned all of the big ballet works from Stravinsky as well. So she was considered a leading composer of her time. In 1925, she actually visits New York City, and there she met a gentleman by the name of Ralph Barton, who worked for the New Yorker and was the artist, sort of the caricature artist for New Yorker. The legend has it that he proposed her on the day that they met. So they had a whirlwind romance, they get married, but he was suffering from manic depression and also was jealous of Tailleferre's successes. As a matter of fact, one anecdote says when this harp concertino was about to be premiered in Boston in 1928, observers heard some quarrel happening backstage in the dressing rooms, in which you heard Ralph Barton essentially saying, "I will not be known as Mr. Tailleferre." Eventually, they get a divorce, and she goes back to France. During the Second World War, however, her house becomes occupied by the Nazis, so she actually leaves again to come to the U.S. She spends about 4 or 5 years in Philadelphia before going back again to France. She died in 1982, and 1983, and she continued to compose right till the end. So she left over 200 works. She actually later in her life, she composed a lot of music for French TV and films as well. And she was even, she decided to play piano. She was an accomplished pianist. So she became a staff accompanist for a children's chorus in Paris when she was in her 80s, actually. So she continued to compose. This is considered one of her early masterpieces. You will hear the harp. Again, it's similar to Bach in a sense. As the piece opens, it's in 3 short movements. It's concertino because concertinos are sort of considered small concertos. So as opposed to maybe a big romantic concertos, think of like Tchaikovsky's piano concerto, first piano concerto, something like that, where the first movement of that concerto might last over 20 minutes. The entire concerto, 3-movement concerto, lasts about 18 minutes in this instance. As the piece opens, harp is playing sort of within the texture of the orchestra. So the harpist is playing a lot of busy figurations while the flutes in the orchestra are playing the melody. And then there comes some moment in which then the harpist will take more of the melodic thematic lead role until you get the sort of the traditional prototypical cadenza in the first movement, which is sort of the unaccompanied portion where the soloist plays, sort of gets to show their stuff, technical prowess. And so you see that in the first movement as well. Throughout, you'll notice a very interesting colors, and some of those colors are done either with a specific playing technique on the harp, and on the camera you will be able to see the close-up of the harp, which is something that you can't usually see in a concert hall. So I'm very much looking forward to that aspect of this also. But also what happens as far as the orchestration within the orchestra also, it's a very interesting setup. There are 2 flutes and piccolo, no oboes in this piece, 1 clarinet, and then no bassoons, and you have 2 horns and 1 trumpet with timpani and 1 percussion. You hear a big snare drum feature right toward the end of the last movement, something that reminds maybe a listener of A Soldier's Tale by Stravinsky, as well as, of course, with the strings also. So she uses a very interesting color palette or color combinations from within the orchestra to create this unique sense of colors. As I mentioned, Tailleferre, she was quoted by saying, well, first of all, her famous quote is that she said she only composes, she basically was composing out of sheer pleasure for doing so. She always felt she said she would write things that would amuse her. That was really her source of inspiration. She said it might not be the most serious music or dramatic music, but that's what I want to write. And so that's one of her quotes. She also said she liked to kind of play off on what she called the little forms. The little forms, maybe shorter, these dance miniatures of people like Bach and Vivaldi, the Baroque composers from centuries ago. And so she considered herself a neoclassicist in that sense also. Which brings us to, of course, Caroline Mumford is our soloist for this piece, and she's been our principal harpist now for a few years, and it's our pleasure to be able to feature her in the front and center with her own harp cam for this piece. So I know you're going to enjoy this piece, and if you like this particular piece, she's written. Tailleferre wrote a lot of pieces for harp actually. So check out maybe some of her other works for harp, or check out one of her works. For instance, there's a series of piano concertos that she wrote, which she played a solo part herself, and so on. So maybe do a little further dive into Tailleferre's music and her life also. Which leads us to Pulcinella Suite by Stravinsky, as I mentioned, originally from 1920, as I mentioned. Stravinsky essentially liked this piece so much, so it was initially a 1-act ballet, and there were 3 singers, which is interesting, 3 singers plus a chamber orchestra. The whole ballet lasts for about 38 minutes or so. Out of that, he extracted the suite, which you're going to hear, and he liked it so much that a few years later, there's a piece called Suite Italienne that he wrote for violin and piano, and it's essentially the same thing. And then a few years after that, he rewrote that for cello and piano. So there are many versions of this that exist. So you could tell Stravinsky was very fond of this music. Initially, he didn't even want to take the commission, What happened was, after the big successes of the Firebird, Petrushka, and the Rite of Spring, a few years after that, Diaghilev and Ballet Russe, they were doing a big tour of North America. And somewhere in this old library, Diaghilev came upon these manuscripts of old Italian music. It was attributed, later found out it was really by mistake. He thought these were written by a composer named Pergolesi, who died young during his 20s, lived in the early part of the 18th century, and so on. But he fell in love with this music, so he wanted to have somebody to orchestrate it and turn it into a one-act ballet, sort of in the style of a commedia dell'arte tradition of Italy, sort of a look back. So that's what he wanted to do. Stravinsky wasn't even his first choice, but since the Faya didn't want to do it, Stravinsky ended up getting the call, so to speak, from Diaghilev, and he wasn't really initially interested when he heard that, oh, it's a refashioning of work by Pergolesi, because Stravinsky had heard some other works by him, which he thought were not that great. So Stravinsky's like, well, okay, well, let me just look at the music. So Diaghilev gave him the manuscripts that he brought back from the US, and Stravinsky said later on he just fell in love with this music. And essentially what's interesting is Stravinsky said later on, listeners are always surprised to find out how little I changed from the original manuscript than how much I changed, because it sounds like Stravinsky by the end of the piece. And it's an interesting progression. At the beginning of the piece, which is called Symphonia, it sounds more Baroque. Baroque, is that a word? It sounds more like somebody took an old keyboard music or something from centuries ago and orchestrated it for a chamber orchestra. So there's a little bit of in a sense, musically, there's almost another sense of Pulcinella or another sense of play going on. So it's almost like Stravinsky has a mask on at the beginning of this piece, in disguise a little bit. And then as the piece progresses, and there's a movement towards the end where you will hear this big duet between trombone and bass. By then, you know it was written written by Stravinsky. So by then, sort of his mask is coming off. You could see the face, the composer behind the mask, more and more as you kind of go forth. The piece, he also said, and I'm colorblind, so I don't know what he means. He talks about colors, and I talk about colors, although I'm in music, although I'm colorblind, but he's very specific. He says, a color only has value in relation to the other colors, which are sort of placed next to it. Red has no value itself. It only acquires it through its proximity to other red or a green, for example. And that's what I wanted to do in music. And what I look for, first of all, is the quality of the sound, and I also look for the truth. So the trombone bass duet is an example, because we know the trombone playing fortissimo, loud, and the one bass player playing fortissimo is not a fair match, but he does this on purpose. So this is sort of the disequilibrium that he talks about as an example. And then just a few bars later, there's an echo of that passage, but now it's only played by the bass. So then you hear the true color of the bass. And initially you hear this trombone dominant sound you hear the bass, but I mean, let's face it, it's not a fair match at all. And it's an intentional kind of thing. So he does a lot of these things either with the instrumental combinations, or maybe he would change the rhythm, but not change the rhythm, but he will displace where you think the accent should be in a traditional music of the 18th century to kind of insert his own personality into Pergolesi. Well, it wasn't really all by Pergolesi, but all these early Italian music that he was basing Pulcinella on. So this is also within the string orchestra too. It's almost like a miniature concerto for orchestra in a sense. Again, this is not written for a huge orchestra. people were shocked. Diaghilev was shocked too, apparently, because he was expecting Stravinsky to use a fairly large orchestra, maybe not as big as the Rite of Spring, but a fairly big orchestra of 70, 80 people. And turned out it's about half that size. And so Diaghilev was very surprised by that. And Stravinsky kind of set it up almost that way, because he had talked about, oh, I'm going to use the big orchestra. Yep. I'm going to use the harp. I'm going to use multiple harps, all of these things to Diaghilev. And what he delivered was totally different than what Diaghilev had heard, heard as Stravinsky's plans. There's a funny quote. Stravinsky said, after looking at the piece, the completed Pulcinella, and somehow Diaghilev thought Stravinsky was just going to simply arrange the music, just assign different instruments, orchestrate it. And then what he ended up getting, he felt was so different from Pergolesi or the original music that Stravinsky said there was a long silence. And Diaghilev had this look, he said, what can only be called the offended 18th century on Diaghilev's face. But he came around to the piece as well. So it's written for a small orchestra. You will hear in the winds, there's a movement with a big oboe solo, for instance, all the flute solo, all of the winds that are used, trumpet, trombone, as I mentioned, they all have big solo passages where they have a moment to shine. Within the strings, it's almost written in a concerto grosso manner, which is sort of that was a typical Baroque tradition as well. So within the string orchestra, the principals, so the 5 string players, often have a solo role. So it's almost like a solo quintet, sort of nestled within the string orchestra. So you hear that kind of dialogue between the 5 string players, and then maybe that call is answered by the full string orchestra, and so on. So there's sort of that kind of concerto grosso writing is also reminiscent of Baroque music as well. And then again, as I mentioned, increasingly you can hear there's more of Stravinsky. His sense of joke, humor, is kind of creeping in as more the piece progresses more and more into the rousing conclusion. All of this is, as I mentioned we mentioned in the other video earlier, this week is done in conjunction or homage to the ongoing exhibit at the Columbia Museum of Art, which features the works of Escher. And I feel that these 3 works, Bach in particular, of course, because of the overt connection between Bach and Escher's works, but all 3 works sort of highlight the aesthetics of Escher in a musical sense. And so I hope you'll tune into this concert or come in person, or tune into the stream, and then go visit the Museum of Art to take in the Escher exhibit in person as well. So thank you so much for joining us, and join us next month for the annual Beethoven and Blue Jeans concert, which will feature the Fidelio Overture and the Beethoven Symphony No. 2, as well as a piece by my old friend, my high school classmate, James Lee III. So come back and join us for that. Thank you.